The bird stopped singing 3 minutes before the first tank died. Oberleutnant Werner Brandt noticed this from his cupola atop the Tiger tank his crew called Eiserner Wolf, the Iron Wolf. After 2 years on the Eastern Front and 6 weeks in Normandy, he had learned to trust silence more than intelligence reports. Silence meant someone was waiting. Silence meant death was patient. It was July 1944, and the hedgerow country of France had become a maze of green walls and narrow lanes where 60-ton tanks moved like blind giants. Brandt's column of 4 Tigers advanced toward a crossroads near the village of Authie. Division headquarters had assured him only scattered British infantry remained in the area. But the British didn't fight like this. The British announced themselves. The British were polite about killing U-Point 300 meters ahead. Hidden in a shallow pit covered with netting and straw, Sergeant Thomas McLeod pressed his eye to the sight of his 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The weapon was a monster, 10 feet of barrel that could punch through a Tiger's armor at 1,000 yards. The British had designed it. The Canadians had learned to use it like a surgeon's knife. McLeod's crew had been waiting in this position for 3 days, eating cold rations, urinating in bottles, never speaking above a whisper. They had mapped every approach, calculated every angle, identified every kill zone. The Tigers were walking into a classroom, and McLeod was about to teach them arithmetic. He was a logger's son from British Columbia, 31 years old, with hands that could steady a crosscut saw in a winter storm or hold a gun's traverse wheel without trembling as 70 tons of German steel rolled toward him. His younger brother Danny had died at Dieppe in 1942, cut down on the beach before he ever fired a shot. McLeod didn't talk about Danny. He didn't need to. Everyone in the crew saw it and how he cleaned the gun's breech every night, how he checked the ammunition twice, how he never celebrated a kill. This wasn't war for him. This was bookkeeping. He was settling accounts. The lead Tiger passed McLeod's position, its massive tracks churning the dirt road into powder. The tank commander stood tall in his cupola, confident, scanning the hedgerows with binoculars. McLeod let him pass. The second Tiger entered the kill zone, then the third. This was the moment. The geometry of destruction that Canadian anti-tank crews had perfected through months of training and weeks of blood. Strike the middle of the column first. Trap the leaders ahead, the followers behind. Create chaos, then harvest it. McLeod's hand rose. Then fell point 2 17-pounders fired simultaneously from opposite sides of the road. The second Tiger erupted in a column of orange flame as the armor-piercing round entered through the hull and detonated the ammunition storage. The third Tiger's turret rang like a cathedral bell as a round penetrated just below the gun mantlet. Inside, the crew died before they understood they were under attack. The lead Tiger's driver threw his vehicle into reverse, desperate to escape the trap, and drove directly over a concealed mine that the Canadians had buried 3 nights earlier. The explosion shattered both tracks. The Tiger slewed sideways and stopped, a crippled beast waiting for the hunters to finish their work. Brandt's Iron Wolf was fourth in column. He screamed orders into his throat microphone. Reverse, smoke, suppressive fire. But the hedgerows swallowed his voice and returned only the sound of his own tanks dying. A round struck the Iron Wolf's front armor at an angle and ricocheted into the sky, leaving a silver scar across the hull. Before his gunner could traverse toward the source, another round came from a completely different direction, striking the tracks. The tank lurched and stopped. Brandt grabbed his MP-40 and threw open his hatch. He had to see. He had to understand. What he saw made no sense. Canadians emerged from haystacks, from drainage ditches, from behind stone walls that should have been too thin to hide a man, let alone an anti-tank gun. They moved with terrifying coordination, each crew covering the others, relocating even as the German machine guns searched for them. Brandt fired his submachine gun at shadows and hit nothing but summer air, his loader screamed. He was 20 years old, from Hamburg, and his legs were on fire from burning hydraulic fluid. Brandt pulled the boy from the tank and dragged him toward the hedgerows as the Iron Wolf's ammunition began to cook off, sending shells spinning into the sky like dying fireworks. From 300 meters away, McLeod watched through his binoculars as the German officer disappeared into the bocage. He didn't order a pursuit. The lesson was complete. 4 Tigers destroyed in less than 3 minutes. The crossroads belonged to Canada. That night, German radio traffic carried a new warning to all panzer units in the sector. The warning did not use official military terminology. It simply said, "Beware the Canadians. They fight like ghosts." McLeod cleaned his gun's breech by candlelight, counting the rounds they had expended. 7 shots. For tanks. Danny would have appreciated the mathematics. The filet's pockets smelled like the end of the world. Burning vehicles, rotting horses, and the sweet sickness of bodies decomposing in the August heat created a stench that Allied pilots could detect from 5,000 feet. Below them, an entire German army was dying, squeezed between American forces from the south and British and Canadian forces from the north. The only escape route was a narrow corridor near Hill 262, and Sergeant Thomas McLeod had been ordered to close it with 4 guns against 40 tanks. He studied the terrain by candlelight in a bombed-out church, tracing the roads with a finger that still bore calluses from years of logging. The corridor was 2 kilometers wide. His battery had 4 17-pounders and 23 men. Intelligence estimated a full panzer division would attempt to break through at dawn, perhaps 50 tanks, perhaps more, with 10,000 desperate infantry behind them. The mathematics were simple. Each gun would need to destroy 12 or 13 tanks before being destroyed itself. Such mathematics did not account for human survival. Private Jean-Paul Dubois knelt beside McLeod, checking ammunition counts. He was 19, from Montreal, and he had changed since Authie. The boy who had trembled at the sound of Tiger engines now moved with mechanical precision, his eyes empty of everything except calculation. He had stopped writing letters home. He had stopped speaking French, even in his sleep. War had translated him into a language his mother would not recognize. Corporal Billy Whitehorse sat apart from the others, listening to the darkness. He was Cree, from a reserve in Manitoba, and he had learned to read the land before he learned to read books. The others thought he was strange, how he could predict where tanks would appear before their engines could be heard, how he seemed to smell danger in the wind. They didn't understand. The land spoke to those who knew how to listen. Tonight, it whispered warnings. Dawn. The mist rose from the fields like breath from a sleeping giant, and through that mist came the panzers. Hauptmann Werner Brandt led the assault in a Panther tank, one of Germany's finest machines, faster than a Tiger, nearly as well-armored, and crewed by veterans who had survived Russia's frozen hell. Brandt had not forgotten Authie. He had not forgotten the crossroads where his Iron Wolf had died. But he had orders, and behind him were 10,000 soldiers who would surrender or starve if the corridor remained closed. The first Panther exploded without warning. The round came from somewhere in the mist, from an angle that should have been impossible given the terrain. Brandt screamed for his column to disperse, to break formation, but the second Panther was already burning, hit from a completely different direction. The Canadians were using a technique they called the revolving door. Fire, relocate, fire again from a new position while another gun took your place. The Germans were shooting at ghosts that refused to stay still. McLeod worked his gun with the rhythm of a man who had swung axes since childhood. Load, aim, fire, relocate. His crew had practiced this dance 100 times in training, and now the dance saved their lives as German shells tore apart the positions they had occupied seconds earlier. Whitehorse called out targets before anyone else could see them, his voice calm and steady as a heartbeat. Dubois loaded rounds with hands that never shook, never hesitated, never remembered that the men inside those tanks were someone's sons. Brandt saw the pattern. The Canadians were not defending a line. They were defending angles, creating interlocking fields of fire that caught his tanks in crossfire, no matter which direction they turned. He ordered his remaining Panthers to charge the last known gun position, to close the distance before the crews could relocate. His tank crested a small ridge, and there, finally, he saw his enemy. A single 17-pounder, its crew frantically working to displace. McLeod saw the Panther bearing down on them. 80 meters. 60. The gun was not yet loaded. Whitehorse was already pulling Dubois toward the secondary position, but Dubois had frozen. The Panther's gun looked exactly like the tank that had killed his cousin at Cannes, and his body refused to move. McLeod had 1 second to choose. Save the gun or save the man. He grabbed Du Bois by the collar and threw both of them into a drainage ditch as the Panthers shell-turned their gun into twisted metal. They lay in muddy water, breathing hard as the tank rolled past. Then, from positions that Brandt would later swear did not exist, 3 more 17-pounders opened fire. The Panthers' ammunition detonated, and the corridor to freedom closed forever. That night, McLeod sat beside Du Bois in the ruins of a farmhouse. Neither spoke. The young private stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, someone who loaded shells and killed men without hesitation, someone he no longer recognized that McLeod understood. The war made strangers of us all. Rain had been falling on the Scheldt estuary for 9 days without pause. The Canadians called it liquid misery. The Germans called it their only ally. In this waterlogged nightmare of flooded polders, narrow dikes, and fields turned to brown soup, tanks became coffins. A 60-ton Panther could sink to its turret in ground that looked solid from 50 meters away. The war had changed. The hunters had become the hunted. Hauptmann Werner Brandt stood before a map in a concrete bunker, facing 17 tank crews. Most were boys, 16, 17 years old, sent from training schools that had abbreviated their courses from 2 years to 4 months. Their eyes held fear and confusion and a terrible eagerness to prove themselves. Brandt saw himself in those eyes, 5 years and 1,000 deaths ago, when he had believed that courage was enough to stop a bullet. He held up a captured Canadian tactical manual, translated by intelligence officers into crisp German prose. "Forget everything you learned," he told them. "These men do not fight like the British. They do not advance in neat formations. They do not respect the rules we were taught. They fight like wolves, and they will kill you before you see them unless you learn to see what cannot be seen." The boys nodded eagerly. They would be dead within a week. Brandt knew this. He told them anyway, because telling them was all he could offer, because hope was a gift even when it was a live point 50 kilometers west. Lieutenant Edward Chun studied the same map from the Canadian perspective. He was 24, second-generation Chinese-Canadian from Vancouver, and he had graduated at the top of his class in artillery tactics at Petawawa. The old hands in McLeod's battery watched him with suspicion. He was too clean, too educated, too fresh. His uniform still held the creases of the quartermaster's press, and his hands had never pulled a dead friend from a burning gun position. The mission was simple in description, impossible in execution. Hold a single bridge over a flooded canal for 48 hours against an armored counterattack aimed at recapturing Antwerp. If the bridge fell, Allied supply lines would collapse. The entire liberation of Western Europe depended on 4 anti-tank guns and 20 exhausted men. Chim proposed a plan so aggressive that McLeod called it suicide. They would position guns on both sides of the canal, creating interlocking fields of fire. They would deliberately flood additional fields to channel German armor into predetermined kill zones. They would fight without retreat, without reserves, without hope of reinforcement. McLeod listened, calculated, and nodded. Sometimes suicide was the only mathematics that worked. The attack came at dawn on the 3rd day, 2 full panzer companies emerging from the mist like steel phantoms. The first wave died beautifully, tanks exploding in sequence as they entered the kill zones exactly as Chun had predicted. The second wave adapted, using smoke grenades and infantry screens to blind the Canadian gunners. Whitehorse called out targets through the chemical haze, his eyes streaming tears, his voice never wavering. Brandt led the 3rd wave personally. His Panther had survived Normandy, survived Falaise, survived battles that had no names because no one lived to name them. He was beyond fear now, existing in a cold place where mathematics replaced emotion and survival was merely a statistical outcome. His tank reached the bridge. Through the smoke, for one suspended moment, he saw the man he had been hunting for 3 months. That McLeod stood exposed beside his gun, directing his crew as they reloaded, completely focused on the killing work. Their eyes met across 100 meters of war-churned earth. Brandt saw a man his own age, with the same exhaustion, the same emptiness, the same terrible competence. He saw himself in a different uniform. His gunner's hand moved toward the firing mechanism. Chin's voice crackled over the radio. Fire mission on the bridge. Collapse Section 3. McLeod turned in horror. Chun was ordering his reserve gun to destroy the bridge itself, to drop Brandt's tank into the canal along with the only crossing for 10 kilometers. It was tactically brilliant. It was also the death of every plan they had made. The 17-pounder round struck the bridge's stone supports. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ancient structure groaned, shuddered, and collapsed into the dark water below. Brandt's Panther fell with it, disappearing beneath the surface in a fountain of brown spray. The German attack broke. Without the bridge, there was no advance. Tanks retreated into the mist, leaving their dead behind. McLeod watched the bubbles rising from the canal and felt something strange. Not triumph, not relief, but a cold recognition. The German officer had been a professional, like him. They had been killing each other's friends for months without ever speaking. Now one of them was drowning in darkness. Chun appeared beside him, face pale, hands trembling with the aftermath of command. "It was the only way," he said. McLeod looked at the young officer, seeing something new in his eyes. The same emptiness that had claimed Du Bois, that had claimed them all. Chun was no longer clean. Chun was no longer fresh. Chun was one of them now. "I know," McLeod said. "That's the worst part." Werner Brandt did not remember being pulled from the canal. He remembered darkness, water filling his lungs, the cold embrace of death, and then hands, German hands, dragging him toward air and pain and the terrible obligation of continued survival. A medic told him he had been underwater for nearly 2 minutes. Another miracle in a war that had run out of miracles. The IT was April 1945 now, and the Reich was dying. Brandt commanded a remnant SS Panzer unit in a small Dutch town near the German border, not by choice but by order. The teenage fanatics around him still believed victory was possible, still screamed about wonder weapons and final stands, still shot deserters in the town square. Brandt had stopped believing months ago. He had stopped believing in everything except the mathematics of survival, his own and, if possible, the civilians trapped in this pointless last battle point 40 kilometers away. Sergeant Thomas McLeod sat in a burned farmhouse, holding a photograph he had received 3 weeks earlier. His daughter had been born on March 12, 1945. Margaret and McLeod, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with her mother's eyes and, according to the letter, her father's stubborn chin. He had never seen her face except in this single black and white image. He had never held her. He might never hold her, because the war kept finding new ways to keep him from home. Du Bois appeared in the doorway. "Orders, Sergeant. The SS have fortified the town. They're using civilians as shields. Command wants volunteers to infiltrate and eliminate the tanks from inside." McLeod looked at the photograph one more time, then folded it into his breast pocket. He had volunteered for every dangerous mission since Danny died. He didn't know how to stop. The infiltration began at midnight. McLeod's team, Du Bois, White Horse, Chun, and 4 others, entered the town through a drainage system that dated from the previous century. They carried PIT launchers, spring-powered anti-tank weapons that could destroy a Panther at close range, but required the shooter to stand within 30 meters of the target. The mathematics of the PIT were personal. You killed the tank, or the tank killed you. White Horse led them through absolute darkness, navigating by sound and smell and some instinct that the others had learned not to question. They emerged in a cobblestone square surrounded by medieval buildings, and there, like sleeping predators, sat 5 panzers. Guards patrolled with casual arrogance. No one expected Canadians here, in the heart of their defense. Brandt watched from his tank's cupola, unable to sleep, unwilling to close his eyes and see the faces of everyone he had failed to save. He saw movement in the shadows, a shape that shouldn't exist, a discipline that didn't belong to frightened Dutch civilians. He recognized the movement. He had been studying it for almost a year. The Canadians had come for him. He could sound the alarm. He could bring every SS soldier in the town running to this square. He could fulfill his duty as a German officer, as a panzer commander, as a man who had sworn oaths he no longer believed in. He could kill Thomas McLeod. Finally, after all these months of hunting each other across the dying battlefields of Europe, the Brant hand moved toward the signal flare in his belt. Then it stopped. He thought about the civilians in the cellars, the children who had forgotten what silence was for, the old women who gave their food to German soldiers because soldiers had guns and hunger had none. He thought about the SS fanatics who would fight until every building was rubble and every civilian was dead. He thought about victory that meant nothing and defeat that meant everything. His hand found the tank's main gun controls instead. The shell struck an empty warehouse on the far side of the square, drawing every guard's attention. In the confusion, McLeod's team moved. 3 Piats fired in rapid succession. 3 tanks erupted. The SS defense collapsed into panic and crossfire, soldiers shooting at shadows, at each other, at enemies who appeared and disappeared like nightmares. But McLeod fought through the chaos with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had killed too many times to count. When the smoke cleared, for tanks were burning, and the 5th, Brant's, sat motionless, its hatch open, its crew gone, he found a German officer slumped against a stone wall, bleeding from wounds that McLeod could not identify as Canadian or German. The SS had shot at their own commander. The Canadians had shot at everyone. In the mathematics of the final battle, the numbers no longer mattered. Brant looked up at the man who had been his enemy for a year. His English was broken, learned from captured Allied soldiers in prisoner camps he had guarded long ago. "No more," he whispered. "Please, no more." McLeod pulled the German to his feet and supported him as Dutch civilians emerged from cellars, blinking in the dawn light. A little girl offered McLeod a tulip, orange, the color of Dutch resistance, the color of hope that had survived occupation and starvation and war. He took the flower and thought of his daughter, growing up in a world where this would all be history, where men like Brant and men like him would be footnotes in books that children would study without understanding, where the mathematics of death would become abstract, distant, and clean. Brant died 2 days later in a Canadian field hospital from wounds that no medic could heal. He left behind a photograph of his wife and young son, and an address in Hamburg written in careful script on the back. That McLeod kept the photograph. He had a letter to write, a war to bury, and a daughter to meet. The killing was finished. The remembering would last forever.